Hello and welcome back to the English Globe, where we dive deep into international affairs and global economics using clear and easy-to-understand English. I'm your host Adam, and I'm here today with my co-host Julia. We're excited to have you join us for another important episode, and this one is going to be a real eye-opener. So wherever you're tuning in from, whether it's your car, your home, your classroom, or your favorite cafe, thank you for choosing to spend your time with us.
Hi everyone. It's great to be here again. Today's topic is a powerful one that affects almost every country in the world, whether directly or indirectly. We're going to talk about two of the most influential groups in the global economy, the G7 and the G20. You may have heard of them during international summits or in the news when world leaders meet to discuss issues like climate change, inflation, digital finance, or war. But what do these groups actually do? And more importantly, who really runs the world economy today?
That's exactly the question we're asking. G20 versus G7. Who runs the world economy? On the surface, they may seem similar. Both are international groups, both involve powerful economies, and both hold annual meetings. But they are quite different in size, purpose, and influence. Today, we're going to explore their histories, how they were formed, who belongs to them, how they work, what they focus on, and how much power they really hold in shaping the global economy.
Before we get into all the details, let's take a moment to say this. If you enjoy content like this, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, The English Globe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from today. We always love seeing people from different parts of the world joining our global learning community. Also, let us know your thoughts. Who do you think holds more economic power, the G7 or the G20? Your opinion matters, and we'll be reading all the comments.
So let's begin by asking the most basic question. What exactly is the G7? The G7, or Group of Seven, is an organization made up of 7 of the world's most advanced economies. These include the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, Canada, and Japan. It was formed in the 1970s after a period of global economic instability, with the goal of bringing together top economic powers to coordinate on financial matters and make joint decisions that would benefit global markets.
And what about the G20? Well, the G20, or Group of 20, is a much larger group. It includes 19 individual countries and the European Union. Some of its members are also part of the G7, like the US and Germany, but it also includes major emerging economies like China, India, Brazil, and South Africa. The G20 was created later in the late 1990s, as the world began to recognize that the global economy was no longer dominated by just a few rich nations. More voices needed to be included in global discussions.
That's right. The G20 is more diverse, both economically and geographically. It represents about 85% of global GDP and around 2/3 of the world's population. In contrast, the G7 countries, while still powerful, represent a smaller share of the global economy than they did in the past. This shift in economic power from west to east, and from developed countries to developing countries, is one of the key reasons why the G20 is becoming more important on the global stage.
But the G7 still holds a special place in global leadership. Its members are highly developed, politically stable, and often aligned on major global issues. Because the group is smaller, it can act quickly and form agreements more easily. The G7 often sets the tone for global discussions, especially in times of political or economic crisis. So the debate over who runs the world economy isn't as simple as just counting members or looking at GDP. It's also about influence, unity, leadership, and trust.
In today's podcast, we're going to break it all down for you. We'll explore the history of both the G7 and the G20. We'll look at who the members are and what kind of economic weight they carry. We'll examine their leadership structures, decision-making styles, and policy goals. We'll review how they've responded to global crises like the 2008 financial crash and the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, we'll look at the future. Who is better prepared to lead the world economy in the years to come?
So whether you're a student of international relations, someone curious about how the global economy works, or just someone who wants to understand the world better, this episode is for you. We'll keep our language simple, clear, and direct, so even if English is not your first language, don't worry. Just relax, listen, and enjoy the journey. And remember, you can always replay parts of the episode to review and improve your English listening skills at the same time.
Again, don't forget to support our podcast by hitting the like button, subscribing to the English Globe, and leaving a comment telling us where you're from and what your thoughts are on today's discussion. Are you Team G7, or do you believe the G20 is taking over global economic leadership? We want to hear your views and include your voice in this global conversation.
All right, let's get started. In the next section, we'll take you back in time to explore the origins of both the G7 and the G20. We'll look at the historical context that led to their creation, and we'll begin to see how these groups were shaped by the economic challenges of their time. So stay with us, because things are just getting interesting.
Welcome back. In this part of the podcast, we're going to look at the history of both the G7 and the G20. It's important to understand how these two groups were formed because their origins tell us a lot about why they exist today and what kind of role they play in the global economy. So let's travel back to the 1970s, a time of major economic problems, political shifts, and rising uncertainty in the world. This is when the idea of the G7 was born. In 1973, the world experienced a massive oil crisis. The price of oil rose sharply after major oil-producing countries in the Middle East cut supplies to countries they viewed as supporting Israel in a war. This caused panic and economic problems in many Western countries. Inflation went up, unemployment rose, and economic growth slowed down. At that time, the biggest economies in the West were trying to find a solution. They needed to talk to each other directly and come up with a plan.
That's when leaders from 6 advanced economies, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, West Germany, Italy, and Japan, came together in 1975 for an informal meeting. They met in France, and the goal was simple: to talk openly about the world's economic problems and try to find common ground. Canada joined the group the following year in 1976, making it a group of 7. This was the beginning of what we now call the G7, or Group of 7.
The G7 was never created by a formal treaty. It wasn't designed to be an international organization with headquarters or voting systems. Instead, it was meant to be a small, flexible forum where the world's richest democracies could meet regularly, exchange ideas, and coordinate their economic policies. The members trusted each other and shared similar values, which helped them build strong cooperation. Over time, their meetings grew in importance and became a central part of global economic discussions.
For a while, the G7 seemed to be enough. It included the top industrialized nations of the time, and it gave them a platform to lead the world economy. But by the 1990s, things had started to change. Countries like China, India, and Brazil were growing quickly. New markets were emerging. The global economy was becoming more connected, and the voices of developing countries were growing louder. Many experts started to say that the G7 was too small and too exclusive for a changing world.
This need for broader representation became clear after the 1997 to 1998 Asian financial crisis. This crisis started in Thailand and quickly spread to other countries in Asia. It exposed how vulnerable the global financial system was and showed that problems in one part of the world could quickly affect everyone. Leaders and economists realized that it was no longer enough for only the rich Western nations to sit at the table. The world needed a new kind of group, one that included both advanced and emerging economies.
That's when the G20 was created in 1999. It started as a meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors from 19 of the world's largest economies, plus the European Union. This group included countries like China, India, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and others. Together, they represented a much bigger part of the world's population, trade, and economic activity. The G20 was meant to be a place where both rich and developing countries could discuss global financial issues on equal terms.
For nearly a decade, the G20 remained a technical group. Important, yes, but not in the spotlight. That changed in 2008 during the global financial crisis. This crisis began in the United States with problems in the housing and banking sectors, but it quickly spread around the world. Stock markets crashed, businesses closed, and millions of people lost their jobs. World leaders needed a fast and coordinated response. The G7 alone wasn't enough, so the G20 was upgraded to the leaders level for the first time.
That moment marked a turning point. In November 2008, the first G20 Leaders Summit was held in Washington, D.C. Leaders from both advanced and developing economies sat at the same table side by side. They made joint decisions, created action plans, and agreed to financial reforms. Since then, the G20 Leaders Summit has become an annual event, and the group has taken on more topics, not just finance, but also health, climate change, trade, digital innovation, and global development.
Meanwhile, the G7 continued to meet and discuss major issues. But its role started to change. While it still had influence, especially in areas like foreign policy, security, and values-based cooperation, it became clear that it could no longer claim to be the only leader of the global economy. The G20, with its broader membership, was now seen by many as the new table of power. Still, some leaders argued that the G20 was too big and too slow to respond effectively.
That's why, in today's world, both groups still exist, and both play important roles. The G7 remains a strong voice for democratic values, political freedom, and international security. It often leads on human rights issues and foreign policy matters. The G20, on the other hand, is more focused on economic cooperation, global development, and the challenges of a multipolar world. It tries to balance the interests of countries with very different backgrounds and goals, which is not always easy.
To summarize this section, the G7 was born during the economic crises of the 1970s and became the symbol of rich, Western-led cooperation. The G20 came later, formed in the late 1990s to bring emerging economies into the global conversation. Their histories are different, but both were created in times of crisis and shaped by the need for global dialogue. One is small and fast, the other large and inclusive, and that difference continues to affect how each group operates today.
In the next part of our podcast, we'll dive deeper into the members of both groups. We'll explore which countries are part of the G7 and G20, how they were chosen, and what their presence means for global representation and power. This will help us better understand who's sitting at the decision-making table and why it matters. Stay with us.
Welcome back, dear listeners. In the last section, we walked through the history of both the G7 and G20, how they were formed and how their purpose has evolved over time. Now let's focus on a very important aspect: membership and representation. Who exactly are the countries sitting at the table of the G7 and the G20? Why were they selected? And what makes their participation significant in the global economy?
Let's start with the G7, which is much smaller in size. As we said earlier, it includes just 7 countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. These are some of the world's most advanced, industrialized, and democratic economies. All 7 have high per capita income, strong institutions, stable governments, and a long history of economic development. Together, they represent values like open markets, liberal democracy, and international cooperation.
What makes the G7 unique is that it is not a formal organization with strict rules or a secretariat. It's more of a club, an informal group of nations that trust each other and agree on many global issues. The countries were not selected based on a global vote or application process. Instead, they came together naturally because of their shared values, economic power, and historical leadership. Their combined influence is strong, even though they only represent about 10% of the world's population.
Now let's compare that with the G20, which includes a much wider range of economies. The G20 has 19 countries plus the European Union as a single member. The countries are Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the United States. As you can see, this is a mix of both advanced and emerging economies from every continent.
This wider membership means that the G20 is much more representative of the world's diversity. It includes countries with different economic systems, political structures, religious beliefs, and development levels. For example, you have democracies like India and Australia, but also monarchies like Saudi Arabia. You have massive economies like the United States and China, and also smaller players like Argentina or South Africa. Together, these 20 members represent around 85% of global GDP, 75% of global trade, and 2/3 of the world's population.
One big strength of the G20 is that it gives a voice to the global south. Countries from Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East that were not part of the traditional power clubs, like the G7. This is important because these regions are growing fast, facing unique challenges, and need to be part of global decision-making. The G20 offers a space for their perspectives to be heard, even if it's not always easy to reach consensus among such a wide group.
However, the inclusiveness of the G20 is also one of its biggest challenges. With so many members, each with its own interests, political ideologies, and development goals, it's often difficult to agree on bold and fast actions. Some countries prioritize climate change, others focus on economic growth, while some push for trade reforms or debt relief. This makes it hard to move quickly. In contrast, the G7's small size helps it to act faster and with more unity, even if it lacks broader representation.
Another key point to discuss is how countries were selected to be part of each group. In the G7, the original members were already the richest and most influential economies in the West during the 1970s. There was no formal process. They simply came together to solve problems. In the G20, countries were invited based on their size, regional importance, and economic weight. The goal was to create a group that reflected the real balance of power in the modern world. Not just who was rich, but who mattered in the global system.
But this has led to some criticism as well. For example, countries like Nigeria, which has the largest economy in Africa and a huge population, are not in the G20, while South Africa is. Some people argue that the G20's membership is not fully balanced, and that it reflects old political decisions more than current economic realities. Similarly, Spain often attends G20 meetings as a guest, even though it's not a permanent member. So while the G20 is more inclusive than the G7, it's not perfect.
The European Union is an interesting case. It's not a country, but it has a seat at both the G7 and the G20 tables. This is because of its economic and political importance. The EU is one of the world's largest trading blocs, with its own currency, institutions, and global influence. So even though countries like France, Germany, and Italy are already individual members, the EU also participates as a collective voice. This adds another layer of complexity to both groups.
So if we're asking who has more power, the answer depends on how we define power. The G7 has deep economic roots, tight coordination, and a shared worldview, but it leaves out a large part of the planet. The G20 includes more voices, more regions, and more perspectives, but it's harder to manage and slower to move. It's a classic example of efficiency versus inclusivity. Both groups matter, and each brings something different to the global stage.
Let's also talk about regional balance. In the G7, most countries are from North America and Europe, with only Japan representing Asia. This has led to criticism that it's a Western club. The G20, on the other hand, includes countries from every continent: Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. This gives the G20 a more global feel and a more balanced picture of the world economy. That's one reason why many experts believe the G20 is better suited to lead in the 21st century.
But we should be honest. Representation doesn't automatically mean influence. Some G20 countries don't have as much weight in decisions. Often, the most powerful voices still come from the United States, China, the European Union, and a few others. Smaller members may participate, but they may not always shape the final outcome. In the G7, the members are more equal in size and influence, which makes it easier to cooperate, even if the group is less diverse.
In this section, we've seen how membership affects both legitimacy and functionality. The G7 is exclusive but efficient. The G20 is inclusive but complex. As we move forward, we'll see how these differences play out in real-world situations, like responding to financial crises, coordinating climate policy, or managing global trade tensions. Who gets to sit at the table really matters when the world is facing big, difficult problems that need fast global solutions.
Up next, we'll take a deep look into how these groups actually work, their structure, leadership rotation, decision-making processes, and supporting institutions. That's where we begin to see why one group might be more effective than the other in certain situations. So don't go anywhere. And as always, if you're enjoying this conversation, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. We love learning from you just as much as you learn from us.
Now that we've explored who the members of the G7 and G20 are, let's move into something even more technical, but equally important: their institutional structures and governance models. In other words, how do these groups actually operate? How are meetings organized? Who leads them? How are decisions made? These behind-the-scenes details help explain why some actions succeed and others stall.
Let's begin with the G7. The Group of Seven is highly informal in structure. It does not have a permanent secretariat, formal charter, or legal foundation. Instead, it operates through annual summits, hosted by one of its members, who serves as the rotating presidency for that year. The host country sets the agenda, coordinates meetings, and drafts the final communiques. There are no permanent offices or standing institutions behind the scenes to enforce decisions.
Although it lacks a central institution, the G7 is supported by a network of working groups, ministers, and what are known as Sherpas. A Sherpa is a senior official who prepares the groundwork for their country's leader ahead of the summit. These Sherpas meet several times a year to build consensus on policy priorities. In addition, finance ministers and central bank governors from G7 countries meet throughout the year to address global economic challenges and coordinate responses.
Because the group is small and built on shared values, it allows for quick, direct communication between leaders. The absence of bureaucracy gives the G7 the flexibility to respond fast to global events. Decisions are typically made by consensus, meaning all 7 members must agree. While this can sometimes slow progress, the shared political and economic alignment usually makes it easier to find common ground compared to larger, more diverse groups.
On the other hand, the G20 operates in a more structured but complex way. It does not have a formal secretariat either, but it has developed a more detailed institutional process over time. Like the G7, the G20 has an annual presidency that rotates each year. The host nation is responsible for setting the summit theme, planning the logistics, and organizing side meetings. However, due to the size and diversity of the G20, the planning is much broader in scale and coordination.
The G20 has a well-established troika system, where the current, previous, and next presidency countries work together to ensure continuity of the agenda. For example, if India is the current host, Brazil as the past host, and South Africa as the upcoming host will coordinate closely to maintain consistency in focus areas. This three-country structure is essential for managing long-term goals, especially when leadership styles and priorities vary from year to year.
G20 decisions are also made by consensus, but reaching agreement is much harder than in the G7. With 20 members representing very different political systems, cultures, and economic goals, discussions often take longer and can become more complicated. Despite that, the G20 has developed a strong system of thematic working groups involving ministers, experts, and international organizations to explore complex issues like health policy, financial reform, digital governance, and sustainable development.
To support its work, the G20 collaborates closely with major international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, WTO, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. These institutions provide research, policy advice, and technical guidance. Although the G20 has no enforcement power, these partnerships give its decisions more credibility and connection to the global economic system.
Unlike the G7, the G20 has also included regular business and civil society engagement. The so-called B20, C20, W20, and Y20 are side forums that bring in business leaders, civil society, women's groups, and youth representatives. These voices give the G20 broader input and help ensure its agenda is inclusive and reflects the concerns of ordinary citizens. This participatory model is one reason why the G20 is seen as a more modern platform.
Still, critics say the lack of a permanent secretariat weakens the G20's ability to follow through on decisions. Once a summit ends and the presidency shifts, priorities can change dramatically. This sometimes leads to inconsistency and repetition. Important issues may be discussed many times without concrete action. Some experts have proposed creating a small secretariat to manage coordination, monitor progress, and hold members accountable to the goals set during each summit.
The G7 has also faced calls for reform, particularly in terms of transparency and broader engagement. Since its decisions often affect the whole world, many believe the G7 should include voices from developing regions or at least invite them more regularly as observers or guests. Some host countries have already taken steps in that direction by inviting non-member countries to attend summits and contribute to discussions, though this practice remains inconsistent.
If we compare both groups side by side, we see a trade-off between efficiency and representation. The G7 moves faster, makes clearer decisions, and speaks with a more united voice, but it lacks the diversity needed for inclusive global leadership. The G20 includes more perspectives and addresses a wider range of issues, but it often struggles with complexity, slow negotiations, and weaker follow-up. Neither group is perfect, but each serves a different purpose in the global governance ecosystem.
It's also worth noting that neither group has legal power. Their decisions are not binding, and there's no mechanism to punish members who don't follow through. These groups work based on political commitment, trust, and peer pressure. That means the success of both the G7 and G20 depends heavily on the political will of their leaders. When the members are motivated and cooperative, real progress can happen. When there is division, outcomes remain limited.
As global challenges become more urgent, from pandemics to climate change to economic inequality, the world will continue to watch how both the G7 and G20 evolve. Some believe we need a new model that combines the G7's speed and discipline with the G20's breadth and inclusiveness. Others think reforms inside the existing groups can make them more effective. Either way, The structure of these institutions will shape how well the global economy is governed in the years to come.
In our next section, we'll explore what these two groups actually talk about and prioritize. What kinds of policies and goals are on the table? What issues have they focused on in recent years? And how do their agendas reflect their membership and structure? That's what we'll unpack in the next part of our journey through the G7 and G20. Adam, let's now explore the relationship both the G7 and G20 have with the world's major financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and the Financial Stability Board. These bodies don't just offer financial support, they shape policies, offer technical assistance, and dictate economic priorities across continents. How do these two groups influence them?
Excellent point, Julia. The G7 nations have historically held dominant positions within the IMF and World Bank. For example, the United States alone controls about 16.5% of the total voting power at the IMF, enough to veto any major decision. When you add up the voting shares of all G7 countries, they still hold a majority. This means they essentially decide the leadership, structure, and strategy of these institutions.
And interestingly, the G7 nations also traditionally nominate the heads of these institutions. The US typically nominates the president of the World Bank, while a European country nominates the managing director of the IMF. These informal rules have faced growing criticism, especially from G20 member countries who feel underrepresented despite their rising economic influence.
Yes, and this criticism is not without merit. Many G20 economies, like China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, contribute massively to the global economy. Yet they lack proportional representation in these decision-making institutions. That's one of the reasons the G20 was given a more prominent platform, especially after the 2008 global financial crisis. It was a recognition that economic power was shifting.
And that shift triggered reforms. The IMF, under pressure, agreed to quota and governance reforms that slightly increased the voting power of emerging economies. However, the process has been slow. For instance, China's voting share is still less than 7%, even though it is the second largest economy in the world by nominal GDP. So while the G20 platform allows discussion, institutional change is lagging.
The G20 has been instrumental in coordinating macroeconomic policy after the financial crisis. During the 2009 London G20 summit, leaders agreed to inject $1.1 trillion into the global economy via the International Monetary Fund and other institutions. That was a bold, coordinated move, something the G7 never managed to do at such scale, given their smaller scope and differing interests.
Yes, that summit was historic, and it highlighted a major strength of the G20, its ability to mobilize broader consensus across both developed and developing countries. The message was clear. To tackle truly global problems, you need global representation. That's where the G20 shines, despite its challenges in efficiency and speed.
And we shouldn't forget the Financial Stability Board, FSB, which monitors and makes recommendations about the global financial system. It was strengthened significantly in 2009 under the G20's leadership, expanding its membership to include all G20 nations. This helped build a more inclusive framework for tackling cross-border banking regulations and capital requirements.
Exactly. And while the G7 remains influential, particularly in setting the tone for transatlantic cooperation and Western-aligned economic policies, the G20 provides a platform for engaging the full complexity of today's economic world. However, decision-making in the G20 is more difficult due to its size and ideological diversity.
So we can think of it this way. The G7 still holds institutional power, but the G20 is the emerging forum of legitimacy. The G7 may dominate the levers of global finance, but the G20 brings the broader voice, even if it's harder to manage. It's like comparing a small, elite board of directors with a larger General Assembly. Both have roles, but one is more inclusive.
And this distinction is important as we face future crises, like climate change, digital currency regulation, and geopolitical tensions. These require collective solutions, and that's only possible when all major economies are at the table. The G20's diversity is its strength, but also its challenge.
So, in summary, while the G7 has historic control over institutions like the IMF and World Bank, the G20 is pushing for reform and inclusion. The world is no longer run solely by the West. It's a multipolar economic arena now. But power shifts slowly, and institutional frameworks take time to evolve.
Well said, Adam. The battle isn't just about who runs the world economy. It's about whose voice gets heard, whose policies get implemented, and who decides the rules of the game. And that, dear listeners, is the crux of global economic governance. Now that we have explored the institutional power and influence of the G7 and G20 over major financial organizations, it's time to look closely at what these groups actually prioritize in their meetings. Both have broad agendas, but the specifics reveal much about their focus and the challenges they consider most pressing. Let's talk about the major global issues the G7 and G20 have tackled in recent years.
Indeed, Julia, both groups have addressed a range of topics from economic growth and trade to climate change, digital innovation, and health crises. However, their approaches and priorities often reflect their membership and political philosophies. The G7, composed mostly of wealthy, developed nations, often emphasizes issues like democratic governance, human rights, environmental sustainability, and global security. Meanwhile, the G20, with its wider representation, tends to focus more on economic stability, inclusive growth, poverty reduction, and global financial system reform.
A key example is their response to the climate crisis. The G7 has traditionally pushed strong commitments toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions, investing in renewable energy, and supporting environmental protection. This group often leads the discussion on global climate agreements and funding for climate adaptation, especially in developing countries. The G7's relatively unified stance helps drive ambitious climate policies at international forums.
The G20 also recognizes climate change as a critical issue, but faces greater internal divisions because of its diverse membership. Some members are major fossil fuel producers or heavily reliant on coal and oil for their economies, while others are vulnerable to climate impacts. Balancing these conflicting interests makes it harder for the G20 to agree on binding commitments or aggressive targets. Instead, it focuses more on facilitating dialogue, technological cooperation, and financing mechanisms that are acceptable to a broad group.
In terms of global health, both groups learned important lessons during the COVID-19 pandemic. The G7 was quick to pledge support for vaccine distribution and strengthen health systems in poorer countries. It coordinated efforts to fund research and development for vaccines and treatments. The G20 expanded this focus by including all major economies, recognizing that viruses do not respect borders and that pandemic preparedness requires global coordination.
The pandemic revealed the G20's unique strength as a global forum. Because it includes emerging economies, the G20 was able to coordinate a broader financial stimulus package and encourage trade openness to keep supply chains functioning. In contrast, the G7, while influential, could not address these issues alone. The pandemic response highlighted that global challenges require global cooperation, and the G20's inclusive nature made it the primary platform for such action.
Trade and investment policies also illustrate differences. The G7 often supports free trade agreements among developed nations and pushes for rules-based international trade through institutions like the World Trade Organization. It advocates for the protection of intellectual property rights and market liberalization. The G20, while supportive of free trade, also emphasizes the need for developing countries to have more equitable access to markets and resources, promoting policies to reduce global inequalities.
This leads us to the issue of economic inequality and inclusive growth. The G20 regularly discusses how to reduce poverty, improve infrastructure in developing nations, and support job creation. The inclusion of countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa gives voice to millions living in poverty. The G7 also recognizes inequality, but often through the lens of social policies within their own countries or humanitarian aid abroad.
Taxation is another arena where these groups have played significant roles. The G20 has been instrumental in advancing global efforts to combat tax evasion and avoidance by multinational corporations. It backed the OECD's Base Erosion and Profit Shifting (BEPS) initiative and the recent agreement on a global minimum corporate tax rate. The G7 endorsed these efforts early, but the G20's wider reach helped build global consensus.
On the subject of innovation and digital technology, both groups acknowledge the rapid changes shaping the world economy. The G7, with its advanced economies, often leads conversations on regulating big tech companies, data privacy, and cybersecurity. The G20 includes emerging economies striving to catch up digitally and focuses on digital inclusion, infrastructure development, and equitable access to technology.
Security and geopolitical issues, however, are generally more the focus of the G7, reflecting its membership's shared values and alliances. The G7 often discusses sanctions, counterterrorism, and democratic resilience, while the G20 tries to avoid overt political conflicts and focuses on economic cooperation. This division highlights the different purposes and limits of each group.
To sum up, the policy priorities of the G7 and G20 reflect their membership and structure. The G7 is more unified and can push ambitious policies on climate, governance, and security, while the G20's strength lies in its inclusiveness and ability to coordinate diverse economies on complex economic and social issues. Both are vital, but neither alone can solve all the world's problems.
In the next section, we will look more closely at how each group responds to global crises, such as financial crashes, pandemics, and geopolitical conflicts. We'll explore examples of success and failure and how their different structures influence their effectiveness. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the question of who really runs the world economy.
When we think about global economic influence, another critical factor to examine is how both the G7 and G20 shape international financial regulations and frameworks. These groups don't just talk, they implement rules and influence institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, and even regional development banks. The G7, being more historically aligned with Western economic principles, often promotes market liberalization, privatization, and strict monetary controls.
Exactly, Adam. But the G20, with its broader membership, has pushed for more inclusive financial governance. After the 2008 global financial crisis, the G20 took center stage in coordinating global stimulus measures, regulating banking practices, and pressuring tax havens. For instance, under G20 pressure, the Financial Stability Board was given a bigger role in monitoring financial systems worldwide. This shows that the G20 isn't just a ceremonial group, it actively enforces change.
That's true. One thing I find fascinating is how the G20 includes nations with very different economic ideologies, like the United States, China, India, and Saudi Arabia. Despite these differences, they still find common ground on global challenges. This diversity gives the G20 a level of legitimacy that the G7 sometimes lacks, especially in the global South, where G7 countries are often seen as promoting outdated or self-serving policies.
And that legitimacy matters. If you look at climate finance, for example, the G20 countries produce around 80% of global carbon emissions. Without the cooperation of countries like China and India, who are not in the G7, you can't make serious progress. That's why the G20 is becoming the more important platform for tackling global challenges, even though it's harder to reach consensus among 20 nations.
Let's also talk about influence through soft power. The G7 nations have historically controlled much of the narrative through media, education, culture, and historical dominance. But the G20 allows for emerging economies to share their perspectives, promote alternative development models, and shape the global conversation. For instance, India's recent G20 presidency emphasized digital public infrastructure and inclusive growth, a direction that resonates with many developing countries.
Yes. And don't forget that countries like Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia use the G20 to build coalitions, amplify their voices, and push for fairer trade deals. This makes the G20 more representative and responsive to the real distribution of economic power today. The G7 still matters, but its influence is waning as it struggles to stay relevant in a multipolar world.
A great example of this is the recent global discussions on cryptocurrency regulation. While the G7 has been more cautious and regulatory, the G20 opened the door for broader conversation on how digital currencies could benefit financial inclusion in emerging markets. Again, this reflects the different priorities. G7 leans toward risk control, and the G20 toward balancing innovation with regulation.
That contrast also shows in debt relief initiatives. The G7 countries tend to favor IMF and World Bank programs with strict structural adjustments. In contrast, the G20 has led new efforts like the Common Framework for Debt Treatments, which includes China as a major creditor. This helps poorer countries negotiate fairer terms, especially as Chinese loans become more prominent in Africa and Asia.
So when we ask, who runs the world economy? It's clear there's no simple answer. The G7 still pulls weight in legacy systems, like global financial institutions, military alliances, and technological standards. But the G20 reflects where the world economy is headed, toward a more diverse, decentralized, and multipolar order. Each group has strengths, but increasingly, the G20 is where the real future shaping happens.
That's a powerful conclusion, Adam, but we're not done yet. In the next part, let's dive deeper into how these groups influence geopolitical strategy, especially through trade alliances, sanctions, and energy policy. The economic muscle of the G20 is changing the global map in ways we're only beginning to understand.
Now, Julia, let's get into something that shows how deeply these groups impact the world economy, their influence over major international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Historically, the G7 has had more power in these institutions. That's because it was formed during a time when Western economies dominated global GDP and decision-making structures. Many of these institutions, including the IMF, are headquartered in the West and often led by Western officials.
Exactly, Adam. For example, the IMF's managing director has almost always been a European, while the World Bank president has traditionally been an American. These leadership traditions reflect the weight G7 countries have in the voting shares of these institutions. Countries like the United States, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK hold large voting shares, which means they influence lending decisions, reform policies, and the global financial agenda more than smaller or developing countries.
But here's where the G20 makes a difference. The G20 includes emerging powers like China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, who have been pushing for reforms in the global financial governance system. They argue that the IMF and World Bank need to represent the 21st century economy, not the post-World War II order. And these voices are being heard, although slowly. For example, the IMF has undergone some quota reforms in recent years to better reflect the economic size of emerging markets.
China's rise in particular has challenged the traditional dominance of G7 in financial institutions. For example, China created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, as an alternative to the World Bank. This move showed that if emerging economies feel underrepresented in existing institutions, they can build new ones. The G20 serves as a platform where these tensions and proposals for reform are discussed. It doesn't have the power to enforce, but it helps shape consensus.
Also, let's not forget how these financial institutions responded during the 2008 global financial crisis. The G7 was struggling to lead a global response due to limited inclusion. But, when the crisis escalated, the G20 stepped in and became the main forum for crisis coordination, organizing stimulus plans, reforming financial regulations, and calling for a more transparent banking system. This was a clear moment where the G20 showed its ability to act quickly and inclusively.
You're right, Adam. That shift in 2008 was symbolic. The G20's collective coordination on bank regulation and fiscal stimulus brought together both developed and developing countries. It also opened space for conversations around debt sustainability, especially for lower-income nations. Still, critics say that despite the G20's broader representation, its promises often remain on paper without binding power. But in terms of agenda setting, the G20 has become a leading voice.
So to sum this up, the G7 still holds more structural power in global financial institutions because of voting shares and historical leadership positions. But the G20 is catching up, not by taking control of these institutions, but by forming parallel discussions, pushing reforms, and providing a more diverse forum for global development planning. It's more of a soft power versus hard structure situation.
And this is crucial for our listeners to understand. Global governance is no longer just about economic size, but about representation and legitimacy. The G20 brings legitimacy by including voices from every continent, from Argentina to Saudi Arabia, South Korea to South Africa. These countries matter in global development, especially as infrastructure, health, climate, and digital finance become more global in nature.
As we move into Section 9, we need to take a hard look at how the global balance of power is shifting. Julia, what we're seeing is not just a competition between G7 and G20 in numbers or representation. It's a shift in how economic influence, trade dynamics, and political leverage are being redistributed globally. Traditional Western powers no longer hold uncontested dominance. New players are asserting themselves, and the rules of the game are evolving.
Exactly, Adam. One of the most notable indicators of this shift is the growing role of the Global South in international negotiations. Countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa are no longer just rule-takers. They're becoming rule-makers. Their economies are growing rapidly, and so is their political confidence. Within the G20, these nations are forming coalitions to influence trade talks, climate negotiations, and financial reforms.
It's interesting because the G7, once the economic command center of the world, now finds itself needing to collaborate more broadly. In terms of nominal GDP, the G7 still leads. But when we adjust for purchasing power parity, PPP, the G20 economies, including China and India, are clearly closing the gap, and in some aspects, surpassing it. This change challenges the traditional assumptions about global economic leadership.
Another important factor to consider is population. The G7 represents less than 10% of the global population. On the other hand, the G20 includes countries that account for about 2/3 of the world's people. This demographic advantage means the G20 nations have growing consumer markets and expanding labor forces. They're not just exporters of raw materials anymore. They are becoming hubs of innovation, manufacturing, and services.
Yes, and as these economies grow, they're developing new trade networks too. The Belt and Road Initiative led by China is a good example. It's strengthening infrastructure and investment links between Asia, Africa, and Europe. This is reducing dependence on traditional Western markets. In response, G7 nations are also launching their own infrastructure strategies, like the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment.
You're right. And the competition isn't just economic, it's also about setting global standards. Whether in digital technology, environmental policy, or AI governance. Countries like China, India, and Brazil are advocating for models that better reflect their values and needs. This often contrasts with the regulatory frameworks promoted by the G7, particularly in areas like data privacy, labor rights, and climate goals.
Let's not forget the influence of multilateral institutions. For decades, the IMF and World Bank have largely followed the priorities of G7 nations. But now, G20 members are demanding a bigger say. For example, there have been calls for IMF voting reforms to give more power to emerging markets. These discussions are no longer fringe ideas. They are becoming central to debates on economic fairness and global governance.
It's also worth noting that the financial centers of the world are diversifying. While New York, London, and Tokyo remain powerful, cities like Shanghai, Mumbai, and São Paulo are rising fast. Their stock exchanges, banking sectors, and fintech ecosystems are attracting more global investment. This geographic dispersion of financial influence is another sign that the old G7-centric world is giving way to a more complex multipolar order.
So, to summarize this section, we can say that the world is no longer neatly divided between developed and developing nations. The G20 reflects a more realistic map of economic power today. Its members bring diverse perspectives, and their growing influence is changing how the world economy operates. This does not mean the G7 is irrelevant. It just means they are no longer the only ones in the driver's seat.
That's a great way to put it, Adam. And this transition isn't necessarily a conflict, it's an opportunity. A more inclusive global economy has the potential to be more stable, more representative, and more just. But it also requires diplomacy, compromise, and mutual respect among nations. In our final section, we'll explore what the future might look like if the G7 and G20 choose to cooperate or compete.
Julia, as we wrap up our deep dive into the G20 and G7, one thing becomes clear. The world economy is no longer shaped by a single voice or power. It's now a complex conversation among multiple players. Do you think the G20 will eventually take full control of global economic governance?
That's a great question, Adam. The G20 has the advantage of being more inclusive and representative of the real global economy. With countries like China, India, Brazil, and South Africa in the room, the G20 reflects the economic rise of the global South. But the challenge is whether these diverse economies can find common ground consistently to drive global reforms.
Exactly. The diversity of the G20 is both its strength and its weakness. It brings more legitimacy and perspective, but also makes consensus harder. The G7, on the other hand, moves faster because it's a smaller, more like-minded group. That's why we still see it setting the tone in crises, like during the Russia-Ukraine war or the COVID-19 pandemic.
And yet, even the G7 knows it cannot act alone anymore. Global problems like climate change, debt relief, and tech regulation need broader participation. The G7 often invites G20 members to its meetings, which shows it understands the value of global input. But let's not forget, the G7 nations still control most global institutions like the IMF and World Bank.
True, and there's increasing pressure on those institutions to reform. Many G20 countries want a bigger say in global decisions. They argue that the world has changed since these institutions were created after World War II. It's not just a Western-led world anymore. The multipolar reality is here, and it's loud.
You're right. Look at the BRICS alliance too: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They're pushing for alternative economic structures. Some even see BRICS as a challenge to both the G7 and G20, especially if it expands to include other emerging economies. But is the world ready for 3 competing blocs?
That's the million-dollar question. The ideal scenario would be stronger cooperation between these groups. G7 brings speed and strategy. G20 brings size and representation. BRICS brings alternatives and voices from the developing world. If they can work together, global governance will be more balanced and more effective.
But if competition grows instead of cooperation, the risk of fragmentation rises. We might end up with economic blocs competing for influence, similar to how the Cold War divided the world ideologically. That could harm global trade, innovation, and financial stability. So the stakes are very high.
It's a balancing act for sure. In the end, neither the G7 nor the G20 truly runs the world economy on its own. They both shape it, differently, but significantly. And what matters now is how they adapt to a fast-changing world. The real power may lie in collaboration, not domination.
Well said, Adam. The future of the world economy depends not on who runs it, but how well its leaders cooperate. And that brings us to the end of today's deep and exciting discussion. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to check out our previous episodes on global finance, the IMF, China's rise, and more.
And don't forget, if you have ideas or questions about today's topic, share them in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Thanks for joining us here on the English Globe. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and keep learning. Goodbye, everyone.